He has a loincloth wrapped around his waist, which would not have been the case. He is lying almost unmarked. It looks he's just hanging there, and the nails are in his palms rather than probably in his wrists where they would have been. What do you make of all that?
The way I sort of read it is, I think the romanticized image of Jesus on the cross operates further dances with the line that the piece is conveying, which is materiality versus divinity, and how the two intertwine. Because there's the physical reality of Jesus on the cross, which is extremely painful, but there's also the spiritual reality of this being a freeing of sins for the rest of the population. And there's a way where you can compare and contrast this with other pieces about crucifixion and such. I'm thinking off the top, Mel Gibson's Passion of Christ, where the emphasis is very much on the physical torture Jesus undergoes, and how that creates a very different idea of what that image means.
As you're speaking, you caused me to think of Leonardo's Last Supper. It's highly stylized, and I think it was, is it Salvador Dali's crucifixion? He presents Christ. It's a humanized.
It's like a 3D hypercross or something?
Yeah, exactly. These very stylized, idealized images of Christ. And then, like you said, then on the other flip side of that, we have Gibson and these brutal takes on the humanity of Christ, where he's brutalized. What else?
Well, I'm interested in talking about the experience both of us had with regards to this piece. Which is that move from sort of disgust and shock to appreciation, because I think it's an interesting. Because I read a lot of disturbing stuff and watch disturbing
Yes,
stuff
you
all
do.
the time, and yeah, I still experience this sometimes. This is about pieces that have real artistic merit, such as this one, where I think to myself, this is just conceptually disturbing or not allowed. I'm wondering. If such a thing is valid, because there's a way the piece is actively engaging with that response in a way that's productive. So is that emotion? Should we try to dampen down that emotion, or should we accept it and just allow pieces like this to interact with it interestingly?
My gut instinct is to say we should allow ourselves to be exposed to such pieces, mainly because I don't like the idea of the censorship idea or the sanitizing. If we sanitize and censor, what we do is we kind of make everybody conform to an image of what we think is appropriate or acceptable. Plus, there's something on the ragged edge here, the cutting edge. It's uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable, but it does cause us to come to some uncomfortable elements with the gospel and the story of Christ. So my leaning on that is, no, we should allow people to interact. Though, now here's an interesting question. Would you have this hanging in your house?
Yes. I would love a print of this. When I look at this, sometimes I do get really emotional.
But do you want the print or do you want the print? Because I saw the print went from at Sotheby's for like $150,000.
I probably, I don't have the money for that, to be honest.
Where would you put it in your house?
Somewhere important, like base of the bed or something.
Are you thinking it would evoke thought, evoke emotions on people who saw it? I mean, what would your point of having it in your home be?
Oh, I think the point of having it in your home would be, I don't know, I guess the question is, why would you ever have a painting? If it's just to look nice, then, you can
if it's
put
wallpaper,
anything.
you're right, then you could be.
So my idea as to why you'd have a painting is that on your wall, or a print of something on your wall, is that you genuinely would like to consider it. At which point, I think something like this is perfectly fine as something to hang on your wall, because it's something then you could look at and consider, frequently. I think that would be pleasant with this piece.
All right, well, let's crack open another door, and we'll just kind of go into it and see if a few issues emerge. Let's say somebody does think this is heretical and blasphemous and really is offended by it.
Yeah.
Should they have to pay for this and its production?
I think there is a... and I assume you're asking this question on the governmental level.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
The fact is, if this guy had done this on his own, I'm not sure would have even made the news
I think it still would have.
Do you?
I think the perspective would have been different. I think it would be like, look at these wacky, or not even wacky, look at this disgusting, degenerate art world.
Yeah, but would it have caught on the way it has? I think
I think the fact of, I think there is an ongoing discussion and controversy around the National Endowment of the Arts, of which this was used as a piece in that argument that made this piece more prominent. But I think this piece would have still been controversial without it.
Okay, fair enough. But okay, so National Endowment of the Arts, and I'm not an expert on that, and I have to admit I have actually been the beneficiary once, or a few times, quite a few times actually, of the National Endowment of the Arts. But my understanding of it is basically they're taking tax money and underwriting or giving grants to support the making of art by artists.
Yeah. And we could talk, Phil, there's a lot to discuss in terms of the practical application of such a thing. But in terms of the philosophical value of government giving money to art, I'm usually in favor of it. And the reason is, I think there's a lot of art forms out there that don't make money. I think that's pretty obvious. As a poetry fan, I know that a lot of my favorite poetry has made the authors, next to nothing. I also know that pieces such as the one we're looking at, when the artist was starting out, was probably not making a living off this type of art until receiving the National Endowment of the Arts. There's just a lot of art out there that just won't really be supported at all without such an endowment.
But
I think,
aren't you thinking, though, somebody might say to you, okay, if you are reading poetry books that the guy could never make any money off of, maybe it's not that, maybe they're just not good. Nobody wants to buy them. Maybe it has no commercial value.
yeah, the notion of meritocracy of art as being presented through market value, though, I just think historically speaking cannot be true. A lot of some of the greatest artists and writers and such of all time were failures. Van Gogh was a failure.
Yes, but you
Kafka
only
was a
say that because they are marketable now.
Not just that. I think we can say now that artists like Kafka, regardless of marketability. Regardless of marketability, Kafka back then was still a great writer. He was doing things that are worthwhile, and he was talented at what he was doing. Like, these are things that we can say with a degree of knowability. Not that there's an objective standard of art, but we can look at this writer and say, no, he was actually on to something, regardless of whether or not the Times is able to recognize that.
Well, we recognize that there are people who might have been skilled at doing something in the past that is more recognized and acceptable now. I guess the question is, what responsibility does any government have to, or people group have to, support those who don't make marketable art?
I think responsibility is not a way to look at this type of policy. My thinking of it is, does it produce a better society? And I think the answer is yes. I think providing an endowment for art that is not going to be marketable would produce a better society. And I have a rationale as to why.
Okay, hold on. Before you get to your rationale, you're telling me that this picture is going to create a better society.
Yes.
Okay, go for it. I'd like to hear that.
I think pieces like this, well, one way that can make it very simple is I think pieces like this and poetry and stuff like that, or even weird experimental novels or art like that, even if they don't seemingly impact your average person on the street, walking down the street, etc., who will just watch the blockbusters in the theaters and watch TV shows, which is perfectly fine. I think even in that capacity, without knowing it, they're being impacted by such art.
How?
It's simple. Every artist is engaging with a history, a spectrum of art preceding them, right? And innovations made by weirdos usually will eventually show up in your blockbuster movies, right?
Okay, I'll grant you that. There are elements of previous weird stuff that you will see.
Take a look at the French New Wave. In that example, we have a movement of filmmakers making very sort of not what we would consider today to be very marketable stuff. Very strange, knowingly strange.
Oh, wait. You showed me one of these. Wasn't the dinner or something like that?
The dinner?
Remember where they all, there's 6 guests and they all come and have a meal and it lasts for hours?
Oh, that was the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie. However, that was actually by Louis Buñuel, who predates the French New Wave. Although I think that movie was after. He was a surrealist with Salvador Dali. But these movies have created techniques such as the jump cut, for instance, that movies today still use and videos today still use. Another example, I think relevant to the example of the National Endowment of the Arts, if you look at the modernist movement, you'll note that a lot of the people there, the painters and the writers, from Gertrude Stein to Ernest Hemingway to Picasso and all that, were living in Paris at the same time around each other, and that their ability to interact with each other was a lot of the motivation and reason why the modernist movement became as big as it was. And that's not coincidence. It's because Paris was really cheap to live in at the time. And thus artists who could not make much money would just go live in Paris for a while, and they would have this amazing community, and they would influence each other. I think if we had a national endowment of the arts that was, effective, I think we could generate similar amounts of cross-pollination between these communities and get better art as a result. I think the modernist period was immensely beneficial for art.
Well, then let me ask you this. One thing that comes to mind is, obviously, that if there's funds for art, they're being directed by the government to one artist over another artist. I know that they have to compete for these monies. And the obvious thing that comes to my mind is that if the government controls the art, then it must be being controlled by some sort of principle or opinion. And that hasn't always turned out well, because, look at the propaganda posters of Germany, Nazi Germany, and perhaps even America during the World War II time.
Absolutely. This is 100% true, and it is one of the practical problems of talking about the National Endowment. However, at the same time, I think we can acknowledge that you can set parameters that, even if they don't completely remove government influence from art, will significantly, detract from it. Like,
but if you remove the parameters, that's a parameter in itself. The kind of open Wild West, anything that's obscene can be, and I'm not saying this particular one necessarily is, but even if we allow for an obscene image to be commissioned, then what we've said is the obscene is art and worthy of funding, maybe as opposed to a non-obscene piece of art.
Well, if there's funding being provided to both, I think it can be said, instead of it being the obscene is being propped up as art, instead that the government has decided that there should be money provided for a space of art, and that has chosen to opt out of deciding how that money should be applied, but instead applying that evenly with no commentary as to what is good or bad art.
But that's a statement in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, well, regardless of whether or not the Piss Christ, for example, is good art, we are first to acknowledge that as an artistic expression. It's saying something.
Well, but we would say the same thing about a child with a crayon.
Exactly. I think what the government should do in a national endowment is essentially identify how best to spread money around such that it gets to the artists who need it, while also being, to the most minimal degree, somewhat discretionary.
Okay, well, I think there's more here for another time about this whole idea of how government is going to use money. But for today, I'm Chris.
And I'm Elam.
And this is
Infobars.
And thanks for joining us. We hope you can join us for our next episode.
Totus floreo! Amore virginali, totus arleo, novus amores copereo, novus amores copereo.
About information.
Thanks, Elam.